Hi everyone. Today I thought I'd put up a quick video, well, for me quick, on the formation of our U.S. Constitution. This is constitutional history, and I know this part sometimes turns people off. They want to get into civil liberties and civil rights and powers of the legislature, powers of the president, the checks and balances between the different branches and what they can or cannot do, and how our governmental structure can be challenged or can be changed. All of those exciting things, especially the things that are news right now. Some of you hopefully are fascinated by the election, the presidential election, not to mention some of the state elections and federal elections within the state for the U.S. Congress and the House of Representatives and the Senate. Fascinating things and the huge ramifications from it. But the bigger story, I think, for you guys in history of the Constitution is the death of Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the Supreme Court Justice. Why? Because we're not there yet, but we will be soon. We'll talk about how do we know what the Constitution means? Well, we read it and we interpret what we've just gone over or are in the process of going over, what the intent of the framers were when they created that structure of government, what branch can do what's constitutional, what's constitutionally allowed, what's not allowed. It's a government of limited authority. What power remains to the states? What power is in the federal realm? All those questions come up, but there has to be a final arbiter of what those things mean. Is it the president? Is it the people? A lot of people think it's the people. In the big picture, it actually is, in a very narrow sense, the people, because we have the power to amend the Constitution. But short of amending the Constitution, practically speaking, what the Constitution stands for, what it means, how it applies, is determined by the United States Supreme Court. And so these 9 people, and there's nothing in the Constitution that says it's 9. We'll get to that in a later. Well, get to that really now because we're going to talk about the framework of the Constitution. It doesn't say what the membership will be made of in terms of 9. In fact, there were different numbers at different times in the early history of our nation, but we kind of customarily settled at 9 for quite a long time. We certainly want an odd number as much as possible because we don't want to get too many tie votes. And in the early history, we'll talk about that when we get to cases, hopefully soon, because I think a lot of people find that more interesting. When you get the cases, there was an early precedent, if you will, that we wanted unanimous decisions, because when the Supreme Court acted and made a decision, we wanted a sense of this is the law of the land. We didn't want too much a lingering debate or derision over what the truth was in terms of what that document means. So now Ruth Bader Ginsburg is dead, and we know there's a vacancy on the Supreme Court. President Trump has talked about naming a nominee as early as this weekend. So does he have the power to do that? Well, we're going to go through the Constitution and talk about that a little bit today. But yes, he does. He has the power to nominate. But is there any check on the president? Yes, there is. It's the United States Senate. So the checks and balances that we're going to talk about in forming the Constitution today, that's what I'm going to go over briefly when they went down to Philadelphia. One of the checks and balances was that the president picks candidates for the federal judiciary, including the Supreme Court of the United States. Is there a check on the president? Absolutely. Well, there's a political check that we don't talk about too much. The president's probably going to nominate somebody that's so far afield of professionalism, skill, knowledge, experience, or philosophy that's so out of control that public sentiment would be so outraged that they probably won't do it. Sometimes they send out feelers ahead of time to see what the reaction will be with regard to potential candidates to be on the court. But the real block or impediment to presidential choices is the Senate. The Senate can basically decline to approve or overtly disapprove a candidate. Now, it brings up an interesting issue in politics right now is Barack Obama, near the very end of his second term, had a vacancy in the court. Justice Scalia died suddenly, and he named a pretty conservative member of the judiciary already, but was going to promote that individual. The name escapes me at the moment. I think it's Justice Garland, and put him on the Supreme Court. And he was kind of doing it intentionally, meaning naming a conservative, because Barack Obama is not a right-wing person. I wouldn't call him that liberal either, quite frankly, in terms of his outcome of his presidency. He's kind of a moderate, but he appointed somebody that he could live with, if you will, in terms of conservatism. And the Senate wouldn't even take up the nomination, and they had the power to do that. There's little rules like that in our Constitution in terms of when an appointee will come before the judiciary body in the Senate, which is a committee, and then will it be put out to vote? And they can block things through these technical rules, whoever is in the majority party has a lot of power to do that. Right now, the Senate is a majority Republican body. Trump will likely be able to pick a candidate, likely get approval of the Judiciary Committee after hearings, and might be able to put up a vote. And all it is a majority vote. And I think it'd be likely that he would be able to put on another Supreme Court member before the election. Now, some people say, well, that's unbelievable. That's outrageous. Well, maybe it is. But I'm here to talk about whether or not it's constitutional. And it is constitutional. Just as it was constitutional for Barack Obama to do it in the waning months of his presidency prior to the second term expiring. The difference is now there's a little bit of hypocrisy politically, meaning that a lot of people that didn't want Barack Obama to have that appointment says, oh, it shouldn't be done so close to the end of a term of an election. We really don't think that's appropriate. This should be held off to after the election. And that's exactly what the Senate did. They blocked him from even nominating basically somebody to go to consideration to the Senate. And now the tide has turned. But both sides have flipped their viewpoints, right? So the liberal Democrats have said, wait a minute, it is totally inappropriate for Donald Trump to appoint somebody so close to the election and so close to near the end of his first term. But that's the opposite of what they were arguing with Obama. And the Republicans have switched their philosophy on this, right? Because they said it was totally inappropriate for Obama to do it near the end of his election or his term. And now they're saying it's totally appropriate for Donald Trump and within his powers to do so. That's a political question. And I'd love to talk about it with you guys, but it's not a constitutional question. It's really not. So let's talk about what happened. Hey, Philadelphia, we're in 1787. The Articles of Confederation, everyone says it's this terrible thing. It's a nightmare. It's the curse of all curses in terms of governmental formation. I'm going to play devil's advocate and said, although it didn't work and it became ineffective for such a large country, and it was lacking some important tools, mostly taxation and the regulation of commerce between foreign nations and between the states, because the states were 13 basically different countries, and they're taxing each other for imports and exports, and they're really giving each other a hard time for access to ports, and there's no uniform coinage of money. Banks are issuing their own banknotes in different states, and the federal government's also doing it well, also called the Continental currency. Wasn't well received. And so it's chaos. And so there is some real legitimate complaints about the Articles of Confederation. But those people that like very local rule, and like local rule in terms of I want my neighbors and members of my community actually determining how I'll live and be governed within my community, wanted a very small and very weak centralized government. We broke away from Great Britain, arguing that that's what one of the problems was, and we wanted it very local. And thus the Articles of Confederation were made. Confederation means just that, a confederate of independent countries, 13 of them really, under a sort of unified membership. And actually it's called the League of Friendship. It sounds like something from the superheroes cartoons that I used to watch in the 1970s. It failed. No question it failed. So they're going down. They recognize Shays' Rebellion is perfect evidence that right here in Western Mass, a bunch of farmers really got upset because they weren't getting paid by the Continental Congress. They weren't being paid for their service as revolutionary service people. And they have huge debts to pay. There's no relief from the local state government. They take up arms. They take over parts of Western Massachusetts. And they're really wreaking havoc for quite some time. And all this news comes back to people like Jefferson, Washington, John Adams, all these people are like, oh my God, this can happen. We got to quash it. The federal government doesn't have any military, doesn't have any money, doesn't have any power to do anything. And so it was real evidence that if we're going to survive as a nation, 13 colonies have to come closer together in some kind of uniform fashion. And so they sent representation down to, first to Annapolis, only 5 people showed up, but 2 big players, Madison from Virginia and Hamilton from New York, they recognized we got to do it again. Let's reform it next year with better invitations, and we'll do that in Philadelphia. And they go down there to fix. Well, that's the theory. We're going to fix or make recommendations on how to fix the Articles of Confederation. This time, 5 states don't show up, but 12 do, all but Rhode Island. Rhode Island always has an interesting history. It tends to be a little bit of a troublemaker. 12 of them come down there, and they didn't come down with the intent to create a whole new government. They said, we got to do some things to fix the Constitution that we currently have, which is the Articles of Confederation. But very early on, some of the great leaders that we did have in that era recognized that it really needed to be scrapped. So when they first initially go down there, one of the arguments is, and 55 people come down. Different states had different numbers of people, but each state only had one vote. But I don't know how many came down from New York. There was 4 came down from New York. Several came from Massachusetts. Actually, a few came from Maine, even though Maine wasn't a state. It was part of Massachusetts at the time. But a few representatives came down to the Continental Convention. I think 55 ultimately showed up. 70 some odd were invited, and they go down there and they're not quite sure what they're going to do. Make recommendations. How is it going to be just a tweaking, or is it going to go much more bigger in terms of recommendations? A lot of people think they went down there to create a new constitution, and then when they left, it was done. That's the big point of this part of the semester. It wasn't done. They come in, they debate, and they debate in secret. I give them some credit. It was really hot down in Philadelphia during that period of time. I've been to Philly many times. One of the videos I show you, the guy who sounds just like me, said, he grew up in Philadelphia. I didn't grow up there, but I've been there many times. It is hot, man. It is balmy. It's got really heavy, humid air in the summer. I won't go there in the summer. I like to go there in the late fall, or winter even. Philly's muggy, and they kept this before air conditioning, and I love the film I put up there, and I urge you to watch that film. These guys, Northeast, are dressed in wool. They all wear these goofy wigs back in the day to look, I don't know, more serious. And they're miserable, but they did it all in secret with the windows down, and I'll give them credit. Even in that era, everyone loved gossip and loved to talk, but it really was kept under wraps quite well. George Washington was the galvanizing force. He was still believed to be really somebody to be honored, because not only did he lead us in terms of military success against the British during the Revolutionary War, but he didn't take over and say, hey, I'm king now. And there was people that wanted a monarchy, just didn't want the English monarchy, wanted their own. And he wouldn't do it. He said, monarchy is not the way. I'm stepping down, going back to the farm. And so he was very, very much revered as a man of honor in terms of his desire for individual power, although he does become our first president. But he's named the president of the convention. They have this convention. They start having ideas bantered about what to do. And you should know the 3 major ones for history. The New Jersey plan is pretty much going to be a fixing of the Articles of Confederation. We're going to stay still 13 loose states, but what would change under the major change under the New Jersey plan would be that the power to taxation, the power to coin money, and the power to regulate commerce and tariffs, things like that, because that was the major faults with the Articles of Confederation. But some of the other more informed, thoughtful leaders said, you know what? The Articles of Confederation, it just wasn't going to work. We need broader, bigger changes. And that's the Virginia plan. Madison comes with a plan. He's one of the few people that actually have it written down. And unfortunately, most history books, including the videos that I posted, seem to portray these guys as coming down with like a clean slate with no conceptual idea of how government should be framed in terms of the legislature and executive branch and the different checks and balances you might want to build in, so no one branch or one group becomes too powerful. To me, that's a fib. That's dishonest, because we were already practicing and implementing state constitutions and state governments to work as models. And I don't want to make the course overly difficult or burdensome for you guys to read millions of different documents. But if you compare the Massachusetts Constitution, which is about 10 years older than the U.S. Constitution, by the time of the adoption occurs, certainly within a decade, it pretty much mirrors the structure of the federal Constitution. So they had these concepts of what was working in some of the different state constitutional provisions, and they wanted to mirror them. So to say they came down here with, how are we going to run a government? I have no idea. Let's just think it up. They were looking at examples from state governments that were already succeeding and from other concepts that were being debated out and about in the community of statesmanship, if you will. So Madison has it all written out. It's a smart move. I know I usually find more success, even as a lawyer, if we're going to propose a resolution to some kind of conflict. If I come in with a written agreement ahead of time that we only have to modify, I tend to do pretty well. But he had a plan. He's a real intellectual. He's an attorney. He's a very sharp, politically astute guy. But he's not charismatic the way Washington is, or Jefferson's not there, nor is Adams. A lot of people think they are. They're over in the foreign country, France and England, doing more negotiation about monies and settlement of the outstanding conflicts from the recent wars we've had, and they're all doing diplomacy. A lot of people think they're the framers of our Constitution, and they are, in the sense that they motivated a lot of the positions that the document ultimately incorporates, but they weren't even there. Jefferson wasn't there, nor was John Adams. Anyway, so Madison comes up with this plan. We call it the Virginia Plan. Why do we call it the Virginia Plan? Madison's from Virginia, right? He wants to, very proud member of the Virginia delegation. He proposes it, and what is it? It's a very strong central government. It didn't give a lot back to the states. In fact, under the Virginia Plan, if it was adopted, the federal government could veto a state law if they found it repugnant. That's not in our Constitution. It wasn't in any Constitution. A lot of people think it is. It's not. It wasn't adopted. It was rejected. But it was going to have a unicameral legislation, basically a legislative body, and it was going to be based upon population because we're going to be representative of the people, right? Type of republic. Problem with that is, hey, Virginia is going to do great, New York's going to do great, and ironically, little Massachusetts is going to do great because back then we weren't that little in terms of population. I think we're third or fourth out of the 13 states, so we wouldn't do that bad under the system as well. But imagine yourself being lowly, but small, I should say, Rhode Island, who's not even participating, but Delaware, New Jersey, some of the southern colonies or now states are pretty small in terms of population. They're going to be giving up a lot of authority to this central government that's not even going to be necessarily housed in their state, might be pretty far away. And there was a lot of theories back then that powerful government controlling our interests, sitting in a very distant land, even though it's within our nation, isn't a good thing. So there was some real skepticism about the Virginia Plan having this one body legislature where it was going to be based upon representation. Although he did propose a Senate and a House, but it was still vote all based upon population, not upon any other mechanism. And of course, there was an executive. So that's not going to work. Small states are going to say, we're walking, we're leaving. And then comes the Sherman Plan. Roger Sherman, right down here from Connecticut. I'm right on the Connecticut border. Every so often I'll see something reference, Roger Sherman, something, this, that, or anything, some kind of statute. No one seems to remember who he was. But he's the one that said, hey, the Virginia Plan is pretty good, but let's fix it. Let's do the bicameral legislation, meaning that we'll have the legislative body. And a lot of people say co-equal branches of government. I don't know where that comes from. I hate it because it wasn't intended to be co-equal. The focus of government would be the lawmaking branch. It was going to be the legislature. So how do we make that more not equal, but egalitarian based upon state size? Shouldn't larger states have maybe a little bit more yank? Shouldn't smaller states still have a fairly big stake because they're giving up state sovereignty to some degree? And so that's the Sherman Plan. And Sherman says, hey, let's create the House of Representatives, the lower house, kind of like in the Parliament over in England. That will be made up from direct voters, whoever had the eligibility to vote. Back then, it wasn't that many. It was white males, usually of age, 18, maybe 21 in some states, and they had to have a proprietary interest. They had to have some money, some ownership of either money or land in order to be eligible to vote. Some states were more liberal, some just that they had to pay taxes. But generally speaking, it was a limited class of people they expected to participate in democracy. And so that was the broadest form of democratic responsiveness that we would have in our new federal government would be the House of Representatives. Each state would have a number of members based upon the population of their state. So states like Virginia, New York, they were going to have significant representation in the House of Representatives. So Delaware, New Jersey, Maryland, these small states are freaking out. Well, what's in it for us? Why are we giving up some of the sovereignty? They're going to control the government. Well, the second branch of the legislature is going to be called the Senate. And in the Senate, we're going to have people from each state equally, not egalitarian, not equal does not mean equitable. It means pure equality. So on that, each state gets two. So very small states have just as much power in the Senate as major populated metropolitan areas. So Delaware, Maryland, these tiny Rhode Island, eventually when they join, New Hampshire, they're all going to have 2 U.S. senators, just like New York, just like Virginia, and just like Massachusetts. And that was the Great Compromise. So sometimes that's the test question, right? What's the Great Compromise? There's many compromises, but the Great Compromise is the most important branch, and the framers' mindset was the body that was going to create law, because the law impacts how we live and how free we are and what rights we have to give up, would be the bicameral legislation with the House of Representatives being selected based upon representation from each state on population, and each state gets 2 in the Senate. And they also wanted some things to be a little bit stable. These guys were conservative in the big picture. I mean, conservative in the sense that a lot of people wanted elections, and this is some of the debate that was going on. our legislature should only go for 1 year and they should all be up for election. And some of them even put in, and I think it was in the Virginia plan, wanted a term limit right away. You could only serve like 1 term or 2 terms, and you had to take a number of years off before you're eligible to run again, or you would literally not be able to serve at all because they wanted turnover. They didn't want it to become a professional political group. And do we have that today? I think we do. I think we have a very professional political group, meaning that when people get in office, they tend to stay in office, and politicians tend to be classified almost as an occupation. To our framers, that was very repugnant. They wanted change, and they thought that people that served in political life were doing it as a sacrifice for a short period of time as a community service aspect of it. Now we clearly have professional politicians. But anyways, I'm way off track. But to create stability, a lot of people were worried. Some wanted this. Hey, every year there should be election. To create stability, they said, okay, we'll do a fairly rapid responsiveness to the people in the House of Representatives every 2 years. Every 2 years, every single member of the House of Representatives is up for election. It's uniform throughout the United States. The Senate is staggered. It's a 6-year term. Every senator, provided they survive or don't get thrown out of office from being, indicted and have to resign or get impeached, which is very rare, is a 6-year term. But not all senators are up every 6 years. Every 2 years, 1/3 of the nation's senators are up, and it's staggered. Why did the framers do that? And I think it's brilliant because it creates some stability. We don't overthrow the entire leadership of the government in one election cycle. It takes multiple election cycles to determine we really want to change in the people that are in that governmental body. So very interesting compromise on the legislature. And then, of course, we have the president, Article 1, and you should read the Constitution. I put up a really nice link from the Cornell Law Institute. I urge you to read it. It not only has the Constitution, which can be a tough read sometimes. It's dry, right, if you're not really into this. But then they have explanations for each and every clause in there so you can learn about what their intent was and why they were put in there and whether they've been amended over the history of the Constitution. Great, great resource. So that's the Senate, and here, so it's 6 years and it's staggered terms. So initially, when the country first started off, when you ran for Senate, some of you might only be running for a 2-year term, some for a 4-year term, from a 6-year. But upon re-election, because it's staggered, everyone gets 6 years term. So no one is now running for anything but a 6-year term, unless you're running to fill a seat that was vacated through death or resignation. Very rare. In the big picture, very rare. The other thing that surprised a lot of people, we as voters did not get to vote for our U.S. senators from our state. They were picked by the state legislature because they wanted to create a more statesman-like body, because therefore your state legislature, who's more engaged in understanding what the needs of the community, the people, budgetary questions, they're invested in terms of the understanding of the controversies of the day. They should send the best of their leadership from the state to serve in the U.S. Senate. That was up until 1913. That's a pretty amazing length of time. And I noticed recently some senator from some southern state wanted to do away with the amendment to the Constitution and put the Senate back in the elected process of being picked by state legislatures. I don't know why he did that. I don't know, just to get a little news or something, or there's a legitimate argument for it. I don't know why he did that. I should look into it before I talk about it, right? But up until 1913, your state legislatures would pick the U.S. senators because they thought that they would probably know who's best, who's the sharpest in the community, who really seems to be, I don't want to say sober in terms of drinking, but in terms of sober, in terms of looking at a problem and doing the community's best interest with a rational sort of technical understanding of the issues. That changed. We're more democratic now than we ever have been, including the right to vote, but also the right to vote for whom. We can actually vote for a senator since 1913. So that's the legislative branch. What's their main function? To pass laws. Article 1. Any law? We're going to get to this as we get to the case law stuff, which I think is more fun. No, it's a government of narrow authority. We didn't want a government of omnipotent authority that can do everything. We were scared of that. We want to get away from that. We wanted to be free of the yoke of government constantly dictating what we can and cannot do. They're going to have limited authority. We knew that grew extensively since the early days, but at its inception, we listed in Article 1, and you should read the Constitution, what we call enumerated powers: taxes, regulating commerce, coinage of money, approving, if you're in the United States Senate, approving presidential appointments. That's part of the checks and balances. being able to declare war. I can't think of them off the top of my head. I'm doing this off the top of my head. But they were enumerated listed powers, and they were fairly narrow. They've been interpreted pretty broadly over time, especially because of one famous Supreme Court justice named John Marshall, because there's a clause at the end of the 10 or 15 listed powers of the United States Constitution, congressional power. It says, and all things reasonable and necessary to effectuate the listed enumerated powers is also granted to the Congress. That suggested that it's sometimes called the elastic clause or elasticity clause. It gives a broad breadth of what it means to be having the power to tax, broad interpretation of what it means to regulate commerce. So all of those things have been interpreted very, very broadly, and therefore the federal power has grown extensively due to court decisions. So that's Article 1, the Congress. All right, they get a proposal, they send it out to the group. Next one is going to be the executive. Some people wanted council, some people wanted, a team. Some people wanted most wanted a very weak president, actually. The power of the presidency has increased tremendously over time. But don't forget, we're breaking away. Arguably, we think we're breaking away from a king. We're really breaking away just as much from the Parliament of England as we are from a king. But we didn't want an omnipotent individual. No one individual or even groups of individuals with like identity and goals should have too much power. So there was a real fear of creating too much power in the presidency. So in there, they gave a list of powers of the presidency: the power to be the commander-in-chief of the military, to implement the laws that the legislature has put in place. The president doesn't create laws. That's why I love it when I watch presidential debate. And you can see behind me, I got a million just here, but I got them all over the place. I collect presidential memorabilia. In fact, I picked one up on the week. I like Ike. I wish I had $2 from the Eisenhower era. But I love this stuff, and I'm really fascinated when I watch the political debates. And no matter who I like or don't like, I always get really, really mad at the TV when I hear somebody say, well, the first thing I'm going to do when I'm the president is I'm going to do this, or I'm going to repeal that. Well, they don't necessarily have the power to do it. And because they are listed in terms of what the presidential powers are. One of my favorites was candidate Mitt Romney. When he was running, he tried to tap into something that was, he thought, very unpopular, and that was the Affordable Care Act, sometimes called Obamacare. And he kept saying, the first day when I'm the president, I'm going to repeal that. Can he? No. He'd have to have Congress repeal it. Congress makes law, including repealing laws. The president could veto a proposed law, but he can't just go in there and effectually say that law is now null and void. We have checks and balances. That's why I love constitutional history, and hopefully you'll get into it too. So anyway, so the president has very, very, I would say, I don't say narrow, but he has executive powers that are listed in the Constitution. Can't go beyond those, and what those are open to constant debate. In fact, I'll show a film later and I put videos up related to the different assignments. One of them was Harry Truman. My father used to always, I don't know why he used to pick on Harry Truman. He made him stay in the Navy an extra year longer in the Korean War. He was supposed to get out, and they made him stay on for one more year because of the Korean conflict, and he always hated Harry Truman. But Harry Truman tried to take over the steel industry, saying we needed the steel. There was a labor problem, and labor was on strike. And he said, you know what, that's it. We're taking over the steel industry. The government's going to take over for a period of time, so we need it for the military effort over in Korea. And they took it to the Supreme Court, and the argument was President Truman, you don't have the power to do it. Who won? Well, the people of the steel industry won. Truman was exercising executive authority that he did not have. And this happens every so often. If you pay attention, Trump has tried to do, not just Trump, I'm not trying to single him out, but it's the current state of affairs. Trump has tried to do things from time to time, whether it was with DACA or some other issue, and somebody will appeal that, and they go to the courts, and the courts sometimes tell the president, you can do that. It's not necessarily wise or good or happy, but you have the power. Other times, the court says, President Trump, you can't do that way, or you can't do that at all. You don't have the power under the executive authority of the Constitution. That's what we're going to get into. And so these things aren't always so clear when you read the document. What can the Congress do and not do? What can the president do and not do? It's not so clear. But what is clear is what are the the multiple checks and balances between the legislature and the president. Well, one is the legislature might want to pass a law or repeal a law. You need the president to sign on for it to become law, right? We know that, right? Both the Senate and the House. There's checks within the legislature itself. Anything that goes through the House and gets proposed as a bill has to go to the Senate and be approved on the same exact wording. Same with something, if it starts in the Senate, it has to go to the House. They both have to agree. So what are we talking about checks and balances? In the legislature itself, between the two branches or the two bicameral legs, if you will, both have to agree. They have to be identical. So they're a check on themselves. And that's very important. The other is they have a check on the president. So if the president is obstinate about something, doesn't want something to go forward, he has the power to veto a proposed law. So if the legislature came out and did something that the president thought was wacky or improvident or too costly, the president says, I'm vetoing it. So the law is not a law at all. It died. It died as a bill. That old thing I used to watch as a kid, Schoolhouse Rock. I'm only a bill. It's not that bad, actually. Maybe I'll throw it up there just for kicks. You guys can watch that when we get to that stage. So that's one check, is the president can check the legislature by veto. But how can the legislature check the president? They can override the president, but it's a very high hurdle. What is that high hurdle? The Senate by 2/3 and the House by 2/3 have to jointly agree on the same exact language to overcome a presidential veto. And that's a very, very difficult burden, but it is a check on a president that might be, out of control or just on a different page than everybody else in the Congress, at least. So that's a check. Another check is funding. A lot of people don't talk about this one too much, but think about it. If all funding comes through law, which it does, the Congress funds the government, the president might have certain projects and goals that he or she might want to do. And if Congress isn't willing to fund it, it puts a check on that kind of behavior and those kinds of goals. And sometimes the president will have to seek it through other means, which President Trump has done, try to do it through the military budget because he is the commander in chief. I'm not going to get into those specifics, but it's really remarkable, all the different checks and balances between the two branches. The other is the president, in order to run the country, has to get called a cabinet. In many of those cabinet appointments under the Constitution need approval by the Senate, just one part of the Congress. So the president wants to appoint someone as Secretary of State or as the head of the Air Force, the Army, the Navy, all these top level appointments, different ambassadorships, all these very important functions of government get picked by the president. They shape a lot of national policy because of that, but the Senate has to approve. And sometimes you get a Senate. And this is why, they almost always approve everything the president wants in terms of choices for different branches, including the judiciary, which I haven't got to yet. Careful. Don't you think the president knows that? Maybe, I don't know, Trump's a little bit of a throws us a curveball in terms of the style. But historically, if I was the president of the United States and I'm thinking about appointing someone to become Secretary of State or the Secretary of the Environmental Protection Agency or the Secretary of Education, I'm going to probably appoint someone who I think is going to be able to pass the approval process of the Senate. So that's why most of these candidates do tend to pass. There's been some close calls in recent history because Trump tends not to be as worried about what the Senate may or may not do. He is a bit more of a maverick in that regard. But most, I think, do actually vet their candidates quite closely. And so it forces them to cooperate. Checks and balances actually force you to cooperate on some level if you can. Otherwise, the government won't function. Other checks and balances between the two. So the budget's big, the veto, the appointment power of the president. And there's another one that people don't like to talk about because they think it's a wild card, but it has been used 3 times now in our country's history. And the president can be thrown out of office if the Congress, the House of Representatives, decides to indict, which we call impeach the president, meaning bring him on charges, some kind of impermissible behavior that's detrimental to the country. The Constitution doesn't say what that really can be. So if there's a majority vote in the Congress to indict the president, that's called impeachment, that can be done. It's been 3 times done in our history. Andrew Johnson, after Lincoln, he was impeached, meaning just charged. Bill Clinton was charged, and Donald Trump was charged. All that means is to be impeached means to be charged by the House. But in order to throw the president out, we don't take it very lightly. So we wanted to put a check on the legislature here. They just don't throw out people that are unpopular or maybe on very de minimis charges, small charges. They put in a requirement that the Senate has to be 2/3. It's a very high burden, especially if the government has a significant amount of the same political party as the current president. Andrew Johnson came within, I think, 1 or 2 votes of being actually removed from office, came very close. Clinton came nowhere near it, nor did Donald Trump come anywhere near being actually convicted crimes, misdemeanors, and/or wrongful conduct to be thrown out of office. One U.S. Supreme Court member was back in the early 1800s. Guy was actually late 1800s. Guy was kind of a nut. But there's all these checks and balances built in. I'm probably going to miss it too because I don't want to talk for 4 hours on this video. But when you read through the Constitution, you'll see them. Now, everyone likes to say, and then there's a third branch that's also a check, and that's the judiciary. And their check on the legislature is to do what? If the legislature comes out with a law that they deem unconstitutional, they can shoot it down. Not that the law is a good law, not that the law is a bad law. It's simply unconstitutional. The Congress does not have the power to implement that law. It's void because of some conflict that the Constitution requires. They can shoot it down. That was not in the original drafting of the Constitution. That comes later in 1803 with a famous case called Marbury versus Madison. But do we now have a check on the legislature with the courts? Absolutely, but not at its inception. But there is some checks as well on the president. The president doesn't act. Can the court shoot down the president's action, executive actions as unconstitutional? Now it can, but not at the inception of our country. When we talk about checks and balances at the early stage of our Constitution, we're talking about between the legislature and the president and between state and federal. Those were the checks and balances. The judiciary was just put in play because we needed a professional entity to interpret and apply law so people, when they had conflict, could do it civilly and not with, bats and knives and guns, right? We wanted things done appropriately. But later, the court does get an elevated sense of purpose from a famous case called Marbury versus Madison, where the court basically says the Constitution is a law, the judiciary interprets law, so when we're interpreting the United States Constitution, we are the final arbiter of what that document means, and the other branches have to live by it, therefore creating another checks and balances. Any check on the judiciary, anybody says, oh, the judiciary has no check on them at all, they're appointed for life on the federal level. We have no control of them. We can't vote for them. We can't throw them out. Well, we can impeach them, which is very rare. But other than that, there's no checks and balances. Yes, there is. The president picks them. That's one of the checks inherently in there. The president's going to pick hopefully very wise and appropriate people to be in the court. Just not anybody gets on the Supreme Court. And is there a check on the presidential choice? Yes. The legislature in the body of the Senate, that branch of the legislature, can not grant approval. They have to approve. And that's happened a few times in our history. And again, the president tends not to appoint members to the Supreme Court or other parts of the federal judiciary if they're not going to pass Senate approval. So those are the checks on the judiciary. There's another big one no one talks about, but you guys are taking constitutional history. You have to know this one. The Congress actually controls the jurisdiction of what kinds of cases the federal courts can hear, including the Supreme Court. So if they don't like the Supreme Court dealing with a certain matter, they can actually remove jurisdiction from it. It doesn't happen too much because the public tends to get really upset. They'll vote these members of Congress out of office if they take away too much of their jurisdiction because it seems to be a constitutional crisis, for lack of a better way of saying it. So that's sort of the checks and balances in it. And there's other great compromises. I have to mention, I'm sorry it's a really long video, but we have to talk about slavery, at least briefly. We're going to talk about a lot about slavery in a very specific section because we have to deal with it. A lot of the issues that we still have in our country today stem from the history of slavery. But slavery is mentioned in a couple spots in the Constitution. One, I think it's Article 4, was the original fugitive slave law, which basically said an owner of a slave had a right to go into another state and retrieve their slaves without any interference. And secondly, if a slave escaped from a slave state to a free state, they did not earn, for lack of a better way of saying it, their freedom or their liberty. It didn't happen. But the more compelling one is in the Constitution, there is the 1808 provision that's part of a compromise. That 1808 compromise is the South was worried that powerful Northern interests were going to basically shut down slavery or the importation of new slavery, and they wanted some protection for the slave industry, which was fueling much of the Southern economy and some of the Northern economy vicariously. And so they put in there the 1808 compromise, and what that said was, not that it's going to ban the importation of new slaves, but that no law doing so could ever be implemented until after 1808. The people that put that in were pretty wise, not moral necessarily or ethical, but they were wise in this sense. In North America, the slave population was self-perpetuating. There were children born of slaves. The population grew. It's one of the few places in the world where slaves actually multiplied. Southern Hemisphere, it didn't seem to work that way. They always had to import new slaves to grow the slave population. The United States, the continent of North America, the slaves themselves propagated future slaves. sad and disgusting that is, but that's true. And so they recognized by 1808 they had probably the ability to keep the slave trade going of its own volition. They didn't have to import new slaves from Africa. So that's one thing that's right in our Constitution. Talks about, some people say, well, they never used the word slavery. Yeah, they did. They did in 1808. But there's another section where they don't use the word slave, and it's also called the significant compromise. Usually the great compromise is about the legislature being mixed between population and partially just on statehood. But the other major compromise is the southern states. They're not so populated with well, for lack of a better word, white people. And so they have South Carolina, I think, almost had as many African slaves as they did white people that were going to be counted for the census. And that's how we determine how many people are going to be in the House of Representatives. So the southern states saying, well, we want the African slaves to be counted too in terms of population. And the North saying, no, you said they're property. We're not going to count your property. So if we're going to count them as people, you got to give them their liberty. And so this tension was going up. The South says, screw it. We'll stay our own home country. We'll stay South Carolina. We'll stay Georgia. We'll stay, Virginia and the other major slave states. Well, we're not going to do it Virginia wasn't so concerned in terms of population because they already had a huge population. But the other, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, those states are saying we're not going to participate in that. We're going to walk away, and the nation would fold. So as a compromise, not on a person's value, not on the humanity of the question, but just whether they're going to count in the census, had to be compromised. And the compromise was the 3/5 clause. You probably heard that term before. Maybe you didn't understand what it meant completely. Just for purposes of head count, when we do the population to see how many Congress members you'll have in the House of Representatives, African slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person. That sounds so terrible. Well, it is terrible, but it sounds like we're trying to say that's what their value is. That's not what we're trying to do. We're saying for every 5 slaves, they'll count as 3 head count for purposes of population. And that was a great compromise. All of those things are undone, thankfully, by the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which ends slavery forever in 1865. Overt slavery, and it took a long time. It's really amazing that we had this in our country's history. Really sad. But anyways, those are some of the compromises. Those are some of the backdrops of this, of all these people compromising. And some people go back, and I do. I get really mad, and I said, geez, I can't believe people didn't stand up and say, screw it, we'll just go alone as Massachusetts. Massachusetts already ended slavery. I'd like to think for the right reasons, for moral grounds, although African Americans weren't allowed to assimilate in the culture of Massachusetts. But so we're thinking about these terrible things. We're saying, geez, if I was there, I would have fought to end slavery for the country right then, or just been my own country. But you have to remember what these people were doing down there. They're thinking about survival. Could they be invaded very easily by France or England again, or Spain or Portugal? These foreign countries were powerful enough maybe to do it. We were extremely weak. And survival sometimes depends on whether you get you want to go for that whole loaf. You want to go for the ideals that were articulated in the Declaration of Independence, but clearly not exercised for all people, certainly not for women and African Americans. But is it better to fight another day? I mean, this is the argument to the contrary. Is it better to get half a loaf so you can move forward as a nation and maybe rectify some of these problems later on? And that's the consensus of what happened at the time. It was about compromise in order to survive. Do I cut off the limbs to fight the body in order to save the body because the limb is cancerous? And arguably that's the theory of the Articles of Confederation being so problematic. We had to make these compromises that in hindsight seem disgusting, but in the moment, those kinds of trade-offs sometimes happen. I wish it was a more noble document from its beginning, but it's not. And that's the structure we come out of the Constitutional Convention. And I'm going to put up a separate video because I'm already almost 45 minutes ridiculous about the approval process. But when these guys left Philadelphia, they come up with a proposal. A lot of them don't like it. Why? Well, they just don't like too strong of centralized government. But most that object to it don't like it because there's no Bill of Rights. These guys are exhausted. They're beaten. They say, okay, the federal government's not going to have that much authority. How are they going to impinge on our civil liberties? But other people say, they can, be careful. So no, we got state constitutions that most of them already have a Declaration of Rights or a Bill of Rights. Got nothing to worry about. So when they went out to sell it to the other states, that's a real contentious point. And Edmund Randolph, one of the great leaders of our world, our country at the time, although he was down there drafting a new constitution, he initially wouldn't sign the document because he was so appalled that there was no Bill of Rights. But I'll get to that in a little second video I'll do for these chapters. Let me know if you think these videos are too long or boring. They are. I know they are. but hopefully they're a little helpful to tie some things together. And we're just talking about, hey, well, they left for Philadelphia. Now what do we have? We have a constitution? No, we have a proposal. That's video next I'm going to put up. As that proposal goes back to the states, they really believe this part. We, the people, white males at least, in order to ordain a more perfect union, meaning we want a more perfect union. We want a new government of what, though? Power of the people. So in order to make that true, guess who's going to determine whether or not this Constitution gets approved? Not the state legislatures, the people in special constitutional conventions held in each state. And that's where I'll close off. Sorry I'm so long. A little bit fired up. Take care.